Liberation psychology began through many. I think that you would say that the idea is native of South and Central America, and the people who are active in working with oppressed people in South America, which many of them are the native population or the very poor, were Catholic priests, and they began working in the framework of what they called liberation theology. And the head of this movement in liberation psychology is both a psychologist, or was, because he was murdered by the government of El Salvador. He was both a well-known social psychologist and a Jesuit priest. His name was Ignacio Martin Baró. You'll see it here in a minute. We'll talk in a few minutes about the principles. I hope I'm going in the right direction. Yes. Liberation psychology, with the tools available, attempts to say and act to make a significant contribution to solving crucial social problems. Since I guess none of you are studying psychology and have not had the trauma of coming to study psychology in order to save the world and then getting bogged down with lots and lots of what we call positivistic scientific information. Does anybody know what logical positivism is? If you do, raise your hand. Logical positivism? Okay. That is an idea that began to take root in the physical sciences and then was transferred into the social sciences, where what is true is observable, and that's why it's called positivism. You can positively see it. We are interested in describing phenomena rather as accurately as possible, rather than changing the phenomena. And this is what most psychologists in the world study. But liberation psychology is interested in changing things, and that's why it says making a significant contribution to solving crucial social problems, and that is a big revolution in the science of psychology. Liberation psychology views human activity in a political context, and therefore intervention will either strengthen oppressive structures or transform them. Now this is, all this stuff is very important, but, and this, by the way, is a summary of a collection of the articles by Ignacio Martin Baró. It's the only thing we have in English. It's called Writings for Liberation Psychology. But since he he was murdered and his writings were collected into this book, the North Americans who write English have also begun to do some work on liberation psychology, so you can get more books now in English. But this is from the original stuff from him. I should say also, before I go on, that a colleague of Martin Baró, whose name was Paulo Freire, has done a great deal of work in Brazil, especially with oppressed populations, and has developed a term that we will talk about in a few minutes. It's called. Anybody here from Brazil? I can't speak Portuguese. Wait a minute. Well, anyway, the English it's here. I'll read it when I get to it, but the English equivalent is called critical consciousness. And the idea was to go into the remote villages of Brazil, where most of the people could not read or write, and teach them this literacy, which is more than literacy to read or write. It's also political literacy. In other words, to be able to read the newspaper and to criticize, to know what's going on behind that. I'll read it. The idea then is that human beings grow up and function in a political context, and you can't get out of that context. And maybe you're feeling this very much in Kosovo. Some of you are studying public policy. Anybody doing that? Okay. So, but even if you're not, how many people here voted in the last election? All right, very good. Much better than the national average. Okay, because this is, so that means that the people here have some sort of political awareness. And you need that, and what he says here, and I think is one of the most important things that he says, is that anything that you do, even inside your family, but anything you do in work, anything you do in the public sphere, definitely, will either do one of two things. It will strengthen the corruption and the problems that exist today, or it will change. It will not be neutral. So that you have to. There was a very famous song in the United States just before World War II, when the labor unions were still very strong. It's called "Which Side Are You On?" You cannot be neutral. You have to be on one of the two sides. Okay. Liberation psychology is metaphysical rather than positivistic. And this is basically, I think it will say this in a minute, it asks why, not just what. Positivistic asks just what you describe. Metaphysics, I'm talking to people who are learning to go into business and make money, and metaphysics is very, very far from you, I suppose. But the idea is to sit and think why. It attempts to deal with the because and why rather than how. Okay? Whereas positivism deals with what exists, which means positive facts. Liberation psychology deals with potential. What does not exist, but what could exist. This is important, especially if you are a professor working with students. Because if you are a positivistic person, then you give the grades and you evaluate a student on what exactly he's doing at this moment. But if you are influenced by liberation psychology, you see in the student what he or she could be. And you work very hard to try to get that potential out of that student, and try to find ways of doing it. Write it on them. That's what I did with them. Okay, so that's also very important. Any of you have had any connection with humanistic psychology? Some of the stuff is translated into Albanian. The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm is an Albanian, for instance. And the idea of many of the humanistic psychologists is to look for the potential in the human being and not just a description of the way he or she is now. Liberation psychology is contextual rather than individualistic. I'll give you some examples of this later. But the basic idea is that if we do, for instance, an IQ test, we're studying maybe intelligence, and do an IQ test. We test 100 people from one ethnic group and 100 people from another ethnic group, and the second ethnic group is an oppressed group. In the United States, this happened with whites and blacks. And then we discover that the oppressed ethnic group has a lower IQ. Okay, now if you take the individualistic way of looking at things, then you could say that let's just go and just use the whites and the blacks just for argument. And the whites as a group have a higher IQ than the blacks as a group. Then If you were individualistic, you would say that the whites are smarter than the blacks. But if you are looking at the social context, then you are saying that the this is a result of the oppression that they've been going through for many years. Liberation psychology is altruistic rather than hedonistic. Psychology today is influenced by hedonistic principles, which means, and those of you who are studying business, for instance, or management or something like that, most of you have learned that people will work better if they are paid better. People will work better if they get certain advantages, and this is hedonistic, which means that if you give me something, I will do a better job. Whereas liberation psychology talks about altruism. Altruism is what one can do for someone else. And he gives Martin Barrow gives an example of the reaction to the very poor people. I think this was in Mexico, to an earthquake where people gave food that they didn't have, they gave blood, which they didn't have very much of, to their friends who were victims of the earthquake. And that altruism is apparently a characteristic of oppressed people. An interesting addition to this has to do with some research that has been done on moral development. Maybe some of you remember, you studied, probably most of you studied something in psychology from high school. And maybe you have in this textbook the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, who he did work on moral reasoning. And he discovered in his research that men have there are more men at the higher levels of moral reasoning than women. And because Kohlberg himself was not too much of a male chauvinist pig, he realized that something was wrong here with the research, but he couldn't figure out what. And Kohlberg had a student named Carol Gilligan who discovered that the basis for moral reasoning for women, in the United States at least, is different than it is for men. Men have, the culture uses social justice as a criterion for moral reasoning that men adopt, whereas women adopt what's called self-in-relation. The human relationships are a basis of moral reasoning more than social justice. And when she did research that used human relationships as a basis for moral reasoning, the women came out higher. Nowadays, what we believe is that she published a book. It's called In a Different Voice, and she's done a lot of work on what she calls the male voice and the female voice. And lately, we have later research has shown that most of us have both voices in ourselves, and that we can use both of them for moral reasoning, and it just depends on what you research. But anyway, the reason why I brought this up is that the social constructionists have discovered that this idea of self-in-relation is not just characteristic of women. It's characteristic of all oppressed people. And therefore, as you, some of you might know, and some of you males might admit, women are probably the largest oppressed group in the world. And one of the things that we've found is that the self-in-relationship is characteristic not only of women but of other oppressed groups. And this is the idea of altruism rather than hedonism. Liberation psychology is tensionistic rather than homeostatic. Okay, homeostasis, can anybody tell me what homeostasis is? Yes. What's your name?
Val.
Okay.
Keeping the equilibrium of something.
That's right. And can you give me a good example of that?
When it's really hot outside,
Yeah.
you sweat in order to keep your internal temperature really cool.
Okay, so one of the things with homeostasis is the body temperature of the human being. It stays 37 degrees whether it's hot or cold. And as you said, sweating is one of the mechanisms. When it's hot, you sweat, cool down. Another one is the refrigerator in your homes, homeostasis. When it's cold, it's turned off, and when it's hot, the refrigerator turns itself on, the thermostat. Okay, so, and what Martin Barreau believes is that society, bourgeois society, middle-class society, advantaged people have rigged psychology in the direction of homeostasis because they don't want things to change. Whereas liberation psychology is tensionistic, which means that they do want things to change, and in order to change, you have to create tension. And when you create tension, things happen that are often not very nice. Donna wanted me to relate to what she calls the torture and murder of Muammar Gaddafi. I have to say one thing, that in my country, the footage we got was not as explicit as apparently what you have seen here. No beatings were shown, and the shooting itself was not shown either. So I was not really aware about how nauseating what you've probably seen was. But at any rate, the idea of creating change always creates tension. And as creates tension, then things that are not pleasant happen. But the murder of Gaddafi is something a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Liberation psychology is constructionist rather than ahistorical. Constructionist meaning here that we're talking about the historical context. The classical type of psychology is that the human being is the human being. If he lived in the 15th century or the 21st century, if he was born to a noble person in Europe, or he was born to an African peasant in Tanzania, it's the same person, and you can do research on that person, and you can make conclusions about this. And liberation psychology says you cannot do this without understanding the historical and social context. For instance, models such as intelligence are socially constructed. This is a huge problem for psychologists because almost all intelligence tests were born and bred in the United States, and then they were adapted to other places. And so they are using the concept of intelligence that was developed by a French psychologist called Alfred Binet, and then was developed further by an American psychologist called David Wexler. It has never been tested or discussed whether African culture or Japanese culture would define, if intelligence tests were first developed in those places, would intelligence tests look differently, and would the criteria for intelligence be different? We don't know. We're stuck with the North American Western model of intelligence, and it might be greatly distorting what intelligence is in the rest of the world, which is about 4/5 of the human population. I suppose right now, if you wanted to develop a more culturally representative intelligence test, you would have to do it in China, where there are more than 1 billion people. Okay, now revision of theories according to liberation psychology are praxis-driven. Praxis-driven means that you go out into the field, you